Hey guys, it's the VC Andrews Critiquer. While all children except one grow up, most of us still have an inner child that wants to stay young and enjoy all the fun things we used to do as kids. I know I sure do. And in 1904, Jay and Barry introduced us to this child who never grows up, and more importantly, a living embodiment for that desire. I'm of course talking about Peter Pan.
You probably all know the story by now, but for the sake of professionalism, here it is. It's the story of Wendy, John, and Michael Darling, three kids living in London during the early 1900s who like to play games based on stories the oldest child, Wendy, tells them about a boy who never grows up called Peter Pan and his arch-enemy Captain Hook, who wants lethal vengeance on the boy for cutting off his hand and feeding it to a crocodile. Their mother, Mary Darling, finds their antics charming, but their father, George Darling,
well, Mr. Darling was a practical man.
And being a practical man, he feels that Wendy's getting too old for these silly games, and that tomorrow she's moving out of the nursery and going to be forced to partake in more adult hobbies that don't include playing with her brothers. And on top of that, he decides their dog Nana isn't the most qualified to be the kid's nanny and should be chained outside. But wouldn't you know it, by astonishing coincidence, Peter Pan just happens to be real and often comes to listen to Wendy's stories since they're all about him. And that particular night, while coming to retrieve his shadow that he left during his last visit, he invites Wendy and her brothers to be part of his Lost Boys Club in Neverland, a parallel fantasy universe where no one ages and they'll be able to enjoy childhood forever. Hurt by their pop's mean treatment towards them, they accept the offer and fly off to Neverland, where they have a great time visiting mermaids, dancing with Native Americans, and annoying the hell out of Hook. But soon tension starts to build as Wendy starts to wonder if Peter really cares about her as much as she thought, and what's worse, Hook's right on the verge of finding Peter's secret hideouts. Ever since his official debut in the book The Little White Bird in 1902, which was basically his origin story, and his proper debut in the Duke of York's Theatre in 1904, Peter Pan has made many people, both young and old, soar higher figuratively than any amount of pixie dust could literally. And the boy has survived in countless adaptations over the years, with musicals, TV shows, animes, and even a decent sequel. Well, that one was decent too, but I'm actually referring to this. Give it a read sometime. Anyway, to date only 2 theatrical adaptations have been released. Well, with sound anyway. One from Disney in 1953, which Walt himself didn't like too much, but was a huge critical and commercial hit. And another from Universal in 2003, which wasn't a success at the box office due to severe competition, but was adored by critics and Peter Pan fans alike, and has a prominent cult status today. I grew up with both these movies as a kid and have very fond memories of them both, even if I did have a burning hatred for one of the songs in the Disney version, which I'll detail a little later. But of course, which adaptation is better overall? Well, let's take a flight into Neverland to find out. This is old versus new, Peter Pan. You can fly, you can fly, you can fly, you can fly, you can fly.
It's only fitting that we start with our title hero, an embodiment of the inner child inside us all. Time for the boy who will never become a man. This, folks, is Best Peter Pan.
Look at me, way up high, suddenly here am I on fire.
Yes, Peter soared quite high over the years, and since he is in the public domain, except in his home country of the UK, where Barry donated the rights to a children's hospital, he's bound to continue soaring higher and higher with more works to come. But public domain status aside, it's easy to see why he's so likable. Sure, he's cocky, egotistical, and condescending, but he's also brave, funny, clever, and really is a sweet kid deep down. Plus, his jerkish attitude is pretty amusing at the end of the day. Anyway, let's get into the portrayals now. Unlike on stage where Peter is traditionally portrayed by women, both movies cast actual boys in the role. The original cast Bobby Driscoll and the remake cast Jeremy Sumpter, both of whom were approximately the character's age at the time. But despite the untraditional casting, both boys totally nailed the character. Both perfectly captured Peter's cocky but charming attitude and were a ton of fun to watch.
I'm certainly proud of you, you blockheads.
You must spank the children immediately. before they try to kill you again. In fact, we should kill them.
But I digress. Which one is truly better? Well, as great as both performances are, I feel that Jeremy Sumpter's Peter was better written. What do I mean? Well, better in this case partially means nuttier. Yeah, there are some pretty delightfully bizarre things about this kid that Disney leaves out for some reason. Like here we learn about Peter's backstory. Kind of. Apparently he ran away from home the day he was born after hearing his parents wonder aloud what he'd be like as a man. It's not really made clear how he came to Neverland or met Tinkerbell and stuff, but just the idea of him being smart enough to understand his parents the day he was born is just so delightfully crazy. You also have to wonder how a newborn baby was able to sneak out of the hospital all by himself without anyone seeing him. Maybe he was Stewie Griffin's ancestor. We don't know anything about Disney's Peter's backstory, but the fact that he has pointy ears suggests that he's a native to Neverland. There's also another funny scene that Disney leaves out where the boys are about to carry Wendy into the house but decide not to because their hands are so dirty. So do they wash them? No. Listen to this.
We shall build a house around her.
Again, it's so funny that he'd go to that trouble when there was a much easier solution. Hell, what were they gonna do with that house after she woke up and went to their usual house? Use it as a summer home? But again, these scenes just make Peter all the more entertaining. I also like how the new movie handles his relationship with Wendy. Peter is clearly very in love with Wendy in this version.
They're girls too.
Girls are much too clever to fall out of their prams.
The only thing is, he doesn't want to flat out admit it because love is typically something associated with adults, something Peter wants no part of. So Wendy encouraging him to admit his feelings for her just aggravates him, making for some great tension in the story. I'll detail this a little later. The Disney version definitely thought of Wendy as a friend, but there never seemed to be much romantic feelings from him. Hell, just listen to how he describes girls.
Girls talk too much.
Yes, girls talk to...
Again, Driscoll and Sumter both did great at portraying the character, but with more bizarre writing and a dramatic love arc with Wendy, the live-action Peter Pan just came off as the more interesting character.
Point goes to the new.
You're charged with high treason.
Now that we've looked at our male lead, let's take a look at our female lead. A girl who's fun-loving like her boyfriend, but also level-headed and doesn't take kindly when she feels her boyfriend isn't treating her right. This is Best Wendy. Okay, all that perfectly describes Wendy Testaberger, I'll give you that, but I'm actually referring to Best Wendy Darling.
Look at me way up high, suddenly here am I on fire.
There's a reason this story used to be called Peter Pan and Wendy. Yeah, Wendy Darling is almost as prominent in the story as Peter, as a lot of the film is around her dilemma of whether or not she should grow up or, well, not grow up. It's especially hard for Wendy because this character is kind of dead in the middle of both phases. Yes, she does indeed love all the fun games and mischief that come with being a child, but at the same time, she is the most mature and responsible kid of the gang, so the world of adulthood is calling out to her almost as loudly as her inner child. Not helped much by Peter's lack of feelings for her later on. This makes her a pretty complex character, and both films do a respectable job at showing that conflict. But now let's examine the respective portrayals of Catherine Beaumont and Rachel Hurd Wood. Unlike with Peter, this one is a bit more one-sided, and again in favor of the new, but please note the words, a bit. Yeah, I bet you thought this would be another meek 50s damsel in distress versus strong modern media girl scenario. But no, Disney's Wendy is actually a very strong character herself, who does not let herself be pushed around by anyone.
Squawk, get 'em firewood.
Squawk, no, get 'em firewood. Squawk, go home.
The pen or the plank?
Captain Hook, we will never join your crew.
Hell, even when she's faced with death, she takes it pretty damn well, only shedding a single tear. That's dignity, kid. But the difference between her and the live-action Wendy is the latter is a bit more entertainingly strong-willed. Yeah, this kid has a pretty twisted sense of humor and lust for Tarantino-style violence. It's mostly in good nature, but Yeah, she's almost as nutty as Peter at times.
At which time his eyes turn red. It's most beastly, disgusting stuff. The sticky, sweet kind.
But again, this makes her a very amusing character to watch. Plus, it also explains why Peter fell for her to begin with and vice versa. These two have very similar dark but charming personalities, so you could totally see them going for each other. Now, I'd rather wait to talk about how her dismay over Peter's lack of affection for her makes her question how awesome maternal childhood really is in the best story round. But for now, I'll just say that in the new, it also leads to another pretty shocking and dark contemplation from her that makes for some really damn good drama and tension in the story. Again, Catherine Beaumont's Wendy is very well written for a pre-1980s Disney female character. She doesn't take any BS and is also a very supportive and likable girl. But for being more entertaining and slightly more developed, Rachel Hurd Wood has my vote on this one.
Point goes to the new.
Ugh.
But every fantasy be need a swashbuckling villain who'll never be letting you off the hook with your life. And ours just happens to be the most famous villain ever to sail the seven seas of media. Well, second most famous. Third most famous. Really? This is best Captain Hook.
Look at me, way up high, suddenly here am I on fire.
I think most people can agree that Captain Hook is a damn good villain. He's delightfully campy and silly, but still cruel and ruthless enough to be considered a legit threat. But which portrayal captures that better? Heinz Conried, aka Dr. Terwilliger, or Jason Isaacs, aka Lucius Malfoy? Well, let's see. Both depictions are indeed very cunning and manipulative, which I'll detail more in the best story round, and also pretty despicable. But on the whole, I feel that Jason Isaacs' Hook is a bit of a lightweight. And that's kind of surprising because the guy who played Lucius Malfoy, Voldemort's right-hand man, should be a perfect casting choice. In theory. Yeah, we all remember Lucius as a cold-blooded psycho just like his master Voldemort, but looking back at him, yeah, he had a few intimidating moments, but he was mostly just a snobbish jerk, and not even as much of one as his son Draco. And that's how this Captain Hook seems to be. He's not all that funny, and while he does have a few legitimately intimidating moments, he's mainly just a first-class asshole.
In my dream, I was a magnanimous fellow, full of forgiveness.
Don't fret, my dear.
With Pan dead, we'll both be free.
Hans Conried, on the other hand, was absolutely perfect as Hook. He captured Hook's over-the-top campiness.
That's it, Smee! That's it! Quick, me coat! My best dress coat!
But was also very intimidating and violent.
You wouldn't dare fight old Hook, man to man!
Let's compare how he attempts to kill Peter Pan after capturing Wendy and the boys in both films. In the new version, he poisons Peter's medicine. That's diabolical, sure, but in the Disney film, he gives Peter a time bomb wrapped as a present. Really shows a violence edge in the two, doesn't it? Now, to his credit, while Disney's Hook only makes one kill on screen, kind of, we never actually see the body of the crewman he shoots for singing off-key. Isaac's Hook kills 5 people on screen, and we see the bodies, 4 of those being crew members, and the other being the fairy guide Peter hires to take the darling kids home by uttering the dreaded phrase,
There's no such thing as fairies.
Hey, he said it, not me. But his Hook is still a bit too underwhelming on the whole. I think a great way to showcase this is his ultimate defeat. In the new film, he comes into possession of some fairy dust, allowing him to fly, but the kids start shouting insults to make him feel down about himself, so he'll literally start to go down and into the croc's mouth, as you need to think happy thoughts to make the pixie dust work. He tries to resist, but eventually is like, yeah, I'm old, alone, and done for, and becomes Croc Chow. In the Disney film, sure, he's still a total pansy against the croc, but he puts his all into withstanding the beast, and thus ends up surviving. conniving, allowing him to come back for revenge in the sequel. And there's also the simple fact that Conrad's Hook is just too damn iconic, what with him being prominently featured in Disney villain projects and even getting his own spin-off series. Hell, when you hear the names Peter Pan or Wendy Darling, you don't necessarily think of the Disney incarnates right away, but when you hear the name Captain Hook, 9 out of 10 people probably think of Disney's version. While by no means bad, Jason Isaacs' Hook just didn't seem intimidating or funny enough for my liking. Conrad's Hook was both, making for one of the most memorable and iconic Disney villains ever.
Point goes to the old.
You shall die.
Hey guys, like to change the scenery? Visiting the folks for Thanksgiving. Anyway, now that we've looked at our three main characters, let's look at Peter's supporters for pro-eternal childhood and Mr. Darling's supporters for pro-eventual adulthood. This is Best Supporting Cast.
Look at me, way up high, suddenly here am I on fire.
I guess we should probably start with Tinkerbell, Peter's right-hand fairy. I'm probably gonna get a lot of hate for saying this, but I'll say it anyway. I don't particularly like this character in either movie. Okay, I'll give her credit that she is very expressive, so you can easily tell what she's feeling despite being mute, something not many other characters in fiction are able to pull off well. And it was really cool that she sacrifices herself to save Peter in the third act. But my problem is that for the most part, I find her so unlikable. Whenever she's on screen, she's either abrasive, rude, cocky, or conceited. A lot like Peter himself, but unlike with Peter, she never really seems charming or sympathetic enough. Hell, she tried to have Wendy frickin' murdered when they first arrived in Neverland, and when confronted about it, she damn proudly admitted to it. Yeah, are you really surprised that Peter banished you, Tink? Other than giving her life for Peter in the third act, I really don't see any reason to care about her. So this character's a draw, I'm sad to say. Sorry, Tinkerbell fans. Okay, so the most important side character sucks in both movies, but there are still plenty of other characters we can examine, and this one I think I'm going to give to Disney. On what grounds, might you ask? Well, as I'm sure a lot of you know, Disney's side characters have made for some of the most memorable characters in film history. Even those where the leads aren't too developed or interesting, there's always supporting characters that are bound to capture your heart, and this film is no exception. Mr. Smee, for instance, is probably my favorite Disney villain sidekick ever after Iago.
Crook, crickety-crockety, crickety-crook, the croc is after Captain.
Smee in the new film isn't too memorable, I'm sad to say. The Lost Boys are good in both movies, but I still find the little tykes in the original a lot more fun to watch.
Smash!
Stop! Oh!
Shoot it down!
I really couldn't decide with Michael and John. Both Michaels are good as the curious and innocent youngest Darling sibling, and both Johns are good as a male Lisa Simpson, so both pairs of brothers are a tie. George Darling, again played by Hans Conried and Jason Isaacs, per the tradition of having the same actor of Hook play this character, was also a bit hard to decide. Both do well at being upper-class tight-asses who favor practicality over imagination and won't hesitate to be blunt about it.
This is not a nurse. This is a dog.
But really do have a soft spot for their kids deep down. But kind of like with Hook, the Disney version is more over the top and comedic about it, and thus comes off as more memorable. How about the mermaids? This one is kind of interesting. The new film seems to go for a screw what you thought in fairy tales, mermaids are actually demented as Walter White. But while this is a pretty neat approach, I think it goes without saying that blank stares don't exactly make for much intimidation. The Disney ones are portrayed as fangirls of Peter who get green with envy when they see Wendy around, kind of like with Tinkerbell. But unlike with her, they do still have funny charms, so I think the point has to go to them. And yeah, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Unfortunately, not even Disney was immune to the lack of political correctness in pre-1970s cartoons, and it really shows with the portrayal of Native Americans here. In the new film, all of the natives, save for Tiger Lily, are reduced to about a 30-second cameo. And that's too bad, because I know they could have had more involvement while still being politically correct. But anyway, let's talk about Tiger Lily. Again, I'm gonna have to call a tie with this one, as both depictions do show a lot of personality and charm in their relatively short amount of screen time, even willing to stand up to Hook. I think the last character I want to talk about is the Indian Chief. Again, in the new, he only appears for about 10 seconds with no lines at all, but in the original, Native American stereotypes aside, he is still a pretty likable father and leader. When he thinks the Lost Boys have kidnapped his daughter, he was livid and was going to have them burned at the stake if she wasn't found by sunset. But once he finds out they're innocent and Peter's rescued his daughter, he does express his gratitude and even makes Peter his deputy chief. Plus, I just love the way this guy dances. Just look at him. Okay, this section's gone on long enough, so to wrap this one up, the live action side characters do their job just fine, but it's pretty hard to compete with side characters from animated Disney movies. Oh yeah, and one more thing. Being animated allows the animal characters like Nana and the Croc to be more expressive and sentient than a live action setting would allow. Okay, all done.
Point goes to the old.
It's time for you to drop.
And now we've reached the big tiebreaker in these two versions of the classic story, examining the question of to age or not to age. The story itself. This is Story for the Win.
Look at me, way up high, suddenly here am I on fire.
Like said in the beginning, both these movies are childhood favorites of mine and many other people, and rightfully so. They both stay true to the source material, but also fixed some major plot holes and gave a unique enough spin to be recognized as their own special take on the classic tale. But which spin is better? Ultimately, I feel the live action films is, mainly because the story is much more developed in many aspects. For instance, we see a lot more of Mr. Darling's thought process of deciding it's time for Wendy to grow up. The idea first being put into his head by his even more of a tight-ass sister, and sealed when Wendy gets in trouble for doodling a sketch of Peter in her room at school, and also embarrassing him at his job along with Nana. Not to mention we get to see the scene where Peter leaves his shadow at the Darling residence. That was kinda neat. In the Disney version, we only get one scene of that thought process, where we see his frustration build up when the kids' childish games are ruining his prep for an important work party. While the scene is well made, it's not quite as dramatic or built up as in the new version, at least in my opinion. And of course, both movies have the concept of Wendy building up resentment towards Peter to give her more of a motive to want to return home besides homesickness. In the Disney film, it's mostly because Peter's an adulterer. But like said earlier, the live action film has a unique story arc of Peter and Wendy having a strained relationship, where Peter just can't admit his feelings for Wendy because it just seems too adult-like, which really hurts Wendy. Speaking of which, let's talk about that big contemplation of hers I mentioned earlier. When Hook discovers Wendy's dismay, he charms Wendy and invites her to be a member of his crew under the name Red-Handed Jill. By the way, is that a cool name or what? She asks to go back to Peter to consider the offer, but she seems dangerously close to being on board. No pun intended. And Peter does not take kindly to it. But naturally, Hook has his very crappy looking parrot animatronic follow her back to learn where Peter's hideout is. Hook uses similar manipulation to uncover Peter's hiding spot in the Disney film, where he convinces Tinkerbell to show him where it is so they can kidnap Wendy and she'll have Peter all to herself again. While I say kudos to both movies for answering the question of how Hook found Peter's hideout, I still think the live action film did it better. I mean, for one, did Tinkerbell really think Hook wasn't going to hurt Peter once he found his hideout? Plus, seeing Wendy almost join the bad guys is an effectively dramatic turn in the story and makes for some damn good drama. I think the thing about the live action film that impressed me the most was how it adapted Tink's resurrection for the screen. For those who haven't seen the original play, once Tink sacrifices herself by plunging into Hook's trap set for Peter, Peter has the audience clap their hands and shout they do believe in fairies to bring her back. Both movies knew this wouldn't translate well to the film medium, and other shows have really backed this up. So how does Disney try to adapt this scene to film? Well, they really don't. Yeah, Tink's big death scene in the Disney film, I'm sad to say, is pretty half-assed. All we really get is a brief sequence of Peter telling Tink how much he loves her, and then it cuts to black. We never even see how Tink is resurrected. The live-action film, on the other hand, was ingenious with how it adapted this to the film medium. Here, Peter telepathically asks everyone who believes in him, including the Darlings, the Lost Boys, children all over the earth, and even the kids' parents and some of the pirates, funny enough, to declare their belief in fairies, and this ultimately is what brings Tink back. Now, if you're a fan of the Disney film and are ready to annihilate me, I just want to say there are some things that the Disney story does better, such as the ending. Yeah, I didn't really like the concept of having the Lost Boys come to live with the Darling siblings. I mean, I'm sure Peter was pretty lonesome in Neverland without all his best buds. I'm glad they decided to go back to Neverland in the Disney film. I also like how the film initially makes it seem like the entire adventure was just a dream, well, with it seeming like they're back on the same night they left, their parents never seeming to notice they were even gone, and even Wendy asleep by the mantle. But then, psych! Neverland's just on the same time zone as Narnia apparently, as the parents see the flying ship. That was clever, and it's all topped off with Mr. Darling saying he feels he's seen that ship before as a kid, implying that he was one of the original Lost Boys. My mind is racing right now. And I just want to make it clear, the ways in which the Disney film expands on the original story are by no means bad. There was clearly thought put into them, I just feel there was a bit more thought put into the live action film. So a combination of that and having much better chemistry with our two leads causes this Peter Pan adaptation to soar slightly higher in my opinion. But what really seals the deal for me is, the live action film doesn't have this song.
Following the leader, the leader, the leader.
I think this clip from the remake of Bedazzled perfectly captures my feelings towards this musical hack job.
Sí, de pensar quién sos me revuelve las tripas. Solo pensar quién eres lo que sos ahora. Si me volves a tocar de nuevo, me voy a vomitar en tu cara hasta que me muera. ¿Y sabes qué? Me voy a morir feliz, porque si no tendré que mirar tu puta estampa.
I think it's cause it feels more like something from Barney the Dinosaur or some other bad 90s show aimed at infants than something from Disney. But that's just my opinion, and the rest of the songs are decent. I just had to voice my hatred for that one.
Disney, I love ya, but point goes to the new, which means the new Peter Pan just barely takes home the gold.
The cleverness of you. Oh, for goodness sake.